السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. وبعد. الحمد لله قد بلغنا الله رمضان. For the months preceding this month of Ramadan, we've been saying Allahumma balighna Ramadan. والآن قد بلغنا رمضان المبارك. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The one ayah in the Quran concerning Ramadan that we always hear in the lead up to Ramadan and during Ramadan and after Ramadan is the ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah Ta'ala addresses the believers saying, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu kutiba alaykum as-siyam kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. This is the famous verse that we all know, we're all aware of, where Allah Ta'ala says, O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed upon you as it was prescribed upon those before you. For what reason? For what purpose? لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that perhaps you may develop taqwa of Allah Ta'ala, which is mindfulness of Allah, God-fearingness. So this means that Ramadan is for cultivating taqwa, but is not taqwa an obligation from Allah Ta'ala upon us all year round? Ramadan is not the exclusive month of taqwa, but it is a month where we try to develop the taqwa that carries us through the rest of the year. So what we find in this month of Ramadan is that Allah Ta'ala is commanding us to deny ourselves of what is halal, of halal food and halal drink, so that by denying ourselves the halal by Allah's command, we become better able to deny ourselves of the haram by Allah's prohibition. Now, what should be happening in all of our hearts as we go through Ramadan by denying ourselves the halal for the sake of Allah is that we should be developing through it some spiritual sensitivity. And when you have that enhanced spiritual sensitivity, that awareness that you may not have had before and in such a sharp way, when you have that, you begin to look inward. Because you see, we have the senses of the eyes and the ears, and when you deny the senses, you deny the sensory, it strengthens the ruh. That's why if a person is not looking at the haram or hearing the haram or consuming the haram and they're not involved in any of that, and they even deny themselves the halal through fasting, it enhances the strength of the ruh, the soul, the spirit. And when that faculty, that aspect, the essence of who we are is strengthened, it becomes more sensitive. And as we become more sensitive in the month of fasting, we are able to look inward with more clarity. It's like the pond that is disturbed through lots of activity and movement. It gets muddied. You can't see the bottom of the water. But once it's stilled, you can see to the bottom. There's more clarity. Likewise with fasting. We begin to look inwardly at the bad habits that we have accrued. We look at the inward and outward sins that we may have gotten ourselves involved in, that we built as bad habits. We also look at the virtues that we want to inculcate and see where we are with respect to them. Are we falling short? Are we not? And ultimately, in the process of fasting in the month of Ramadan, what we are doing is weaning our souls from the things that weigh the souls down, things that keep us from treading the path of virtue. Now, we have the very beautiful line of poetry by Imam al-Busayri, rahimahullah, but he talks about the essence of the ego, the nature of the lower self, and this issue of weaning ourselves off of the haram. And he says, rahimahullah, وَالنَّفْسُ كَالطِّفْلِ إِن تُهْمِلْهُ شَبَّ عَلَى حُبِّ الرَّضَاعِ وَإِن تَفْتِمْهُ يَنْفَطِمِ. He says that the nafs, the ego, the self, is like an infant child. So your nafs, my nafs, all of our nufus, that nafs is like an infant child. He says, if you leave it, it will grow up loving tasakko. It's never going to be weaned. You have to wean the infant so that it can go to take solid food. He says, if you leave it, that infant child will grow up loving tasakko. But if you wean it, it will be weaned away. If you go through the process of weaning the child, it'll be weaned. And the nafs is the same thing. If we do not wean our egos from the haram and from the things that are distractions, things that are harmful to us in the long run, we will grow up being attached to those things and we can't get rid of them. But you have to wean them. And so this Ramadan, our Khatirah series, every Saturday and Sunday after Fajr, is looking at certain core virtues, what we call fada'il or munjiyat. The fada'il meaning virtues, and the munjiyat are the things that deliver us and give us salvation, that help us in our journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we will be reflecting on 10 core virtues from the fada'il, the virtues that every single believer should try to cultivate in their life, inside and outside of Ramadan. So by learning about these virtues, inner virtues as well as outer virtues, and committing ourselves to applying them, we understand that is fundamental to us being Muslim. The great Imam Abul Hasan Ash-Shadhili rahimahullah, he said, "Man lam yata'ammaq fi ilmina hada, mata musirran ala al-kaba'ir wa lam yash'ur." He said, whoever does not get deeply involved or plunge himself into this science of ours will die having persisted in major sins whilst not perceiving it at all. If we don't make ourselves aware of the virtues and the pitfalls and how to address the state of our heart, it is very possible that a person could be engaged in things that are min kaba'ir al-dhunub, and they have no idea whatsoever. So there's a fundamental presupposition that we make when we study the virtues. And what is that fundamental presumption? It is that it is possible for us to change. It is possible for us to make positive change. We have the potential to change for the better. And it is possible to remove bad qualities and to inculcate ourselves with good qualities. If there was no benefit, if we were just fixed the way we are, where a person says, I am the way I am, this is the way God made me, that's it, I can't change. If that were the reality, then, as the ulama say, there would be no benefit in Allah sending prophets and messengers. Why would Allah Ta'ala send prophets and messengers telling people to change their character, to adopt virtue, and to get rid of vice if we are the way we are and we can't change? It's because we have the possibility of change that Allah Ta'ala sent prophets and messengers telling us to change. And so these virtues, when we inculcate them, we understand that number one, we can change for the better. And number two, we also learn that in inculcating good, positive changes, we are not asked by Allah Ta'ala or His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to fundamentally eradicate our personality and who we are. We are who we are. Our root personality is who we are. We have our mizaj. You have your temperament, you have your mizaj, the nature with which Allah created you, yet you can still change for the better. And this change is not asking that you fundamentally alter your personality and be a different person. It means that you just take the good and you get rid of the bad. You enhance what you have. A lot of people get really stressed out when they think about change, changing for the better. And I suggest that we measure our words a little bit. Instead of thinking, when we contemplate virtue and getting rid of vice, instead of thinking it's a complete overhaul to who I am as a person, think of it like this. Instead of saying overhaul, say, I am going to make some edits. If you have a document, imagine you're in university or high school and you write a paper for your teacher. You give the paper to the teacher and the teacher says, yeah, the entire paper is garbage, do it all over again. You're going to be really upset. You're going to be really despondent because you spent so much time on that paper. But what if the teacher tells you instead, well, you just need some edits. Here and there, make some edits. And you make the edits. It's not as bad as being told you have to toss the entire thing away. So when it comes to change, inculcating virtue, getting rid of vice, think of it as life edits. You are fundamentally the way you are, and there are certain things that we need to edit in our life. And so we're going to start with the first of these 10 virtues today, and the second one we start with tomorrow, which will be 2 sessions. What is the very first virtue that one should inculcate? There is a hierarchy. There is an ordering to this. The very first virtue that one should inculcate and look towards is the virtue of yaqadha. What is yaqadha? What does that mean? It means wakefulness. Wakefulness is that state of being made aware and conscious. Yaqadha is being woke in a good way. So this is the positive being woke, not the cringe one. So yaqadha is the state of being made aware, the state of consciousness after having been in a state of ghafla, after being in heedlessness. This is the first stage of any cultivation of virtue. So what exactly is this wakefulness, this state? According to Imam Abdullah al-Harawi al-Ansari rahimahullah, in his work Manazir al-Sa'irin, where he defines these terms, he begins with yaqadha, and he says that it is al-qawmatu lillahi hiya al-yaqadha min sinati al-ghafla wal-nuhudu an warthati al-fatra. He says, rising to Allah by waking from the slumber of heedlessness, ghafla, and fleeing from indifference. So it is number one, waking up. It is snapping out of it, coming to one's spiritual senses, and no longer being ghafil. Ghafil. Who is the ghafil? This is the person who is heedless, who is oblivious, who is distracted by everything away from their purpose and what they should be. This is ghafla. So it is rising to Allah by waking from the slumber of ghafla and fleeing from indifference. Fleeing from indifference where the person is really indifferent to the state of their heart. It's a very strange thing to describe where a person is indifferent to whether their heart is being blackened and darkened and sullied or if it's being refined or purified. They don't really care. Now, if any person is feeling the pain of sin or they feel guilt, they feel like they're hypocrites, they feel like they're two-faced in their deen, that they live double lives, that they're one way at the masjid and one way else somewhere else. If they feel that and they don't like that feeling, that is a positive thing because that is a sign of life. It's a sign of life because if the heart was completely dead, they wouldn't care whatsoever. They would not care whatsoever the effects of what they do because a dead heart doesn't feel any pain. So it's fleeing from indifference where a person is not really caring about the effects of what they do inwardly and outwardly. So this is the very first step in cultivating virtue, and it describes that moment when this awareness dawns upon the heart, where the person feels and knows that this is not all there is. They realize that yes, the dunya is exactly as Allah Ta'ala describes it. Mata'ul ghurur. It's an abode of delusion. And they realize deeply, yes, this is a place where I have taklif, there's moral responsibility, and that there is accountability in the hereafter. And there's a purpose to my life besides just drinking, eating, entertainment, working, paying bills, and then dying. There's more to this life than all of that. This is yaqadha. Now Imam al-Harawi goes on to say that this wakefulness, this very first stage, has 3 aspects. And you can look at these as the way to cultivate yaqadha, the way to kindle it. He says, number 1, the first aspect of wakefulness, he says, is the heart beholding, seeing the blessings of Allah, number one, while despairing of ever being able to count them or realize their magnitude, thereby, thereafter, busying the heart with realization of Allah's graciousness in bestowing these blessings and recognizing one's utter failure in showing the necessary gratitude. What is he talking about here? The first step of wakefulness, he says, is when the person opens their basira, the eye of the heart, and they see the blessings of Allah surrounding them, and they realize that there's no way I can count these things. There's no way I can enumerate the blessings of Allah Ta'ala as Allah Ta'ala describes. وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. If you try to enumerate the blessings of Allah, you will be unable to. So that's number one. Just seeing them, recognizing them, and recognizing that there's no way I can enumerate all of these. That's the first step of wakefulness. The second step of wakefulness, he says, is turning inwardly and observing one's own transgression and understanding the danger of that. Thereafter, rushing to control it, to rid oneself of its grasp, and seek salvation by cleansing oneself of it. So the first one is looking at blessings and our inability to count them. The second is looking at our shortcomings and transgressions and understanding the dangers of these things. That's the second step of yaqadha. The third, he says, is paying attention to the passing of the days and the consequent gains and losses one accrues through them. Abstaining from wasting them and instead being protective of them so that one may wake up for what he has missed of them and make the most of what remains. And that third step is describing the realization that we do not have a lot of time and that what is needed is a tadarruk, which is catching up and making up for lost time in the remaining days. So he describes these as the three steps for being in a state of yaqadha or wakefulness. When you combine these together, they give you a sense of urgency. And that is what we are often lacking, a sense of urgency. So even if a person fancies themselves as a quote-unquote practicing Muslim, they would say to themselves maybe, well, I'm not really ghafil, I'm not really a heedless person. I'm fasting on Ramadan, I come to the masjid, I have all of these things that I do. Even if a person fancies themselves as a quote-unquote mutadayyin or multazim practicing Muslim, they can take these three elements to re-energize themselves and to reorient themselves in this path, this suluk, this journeying to Allah and seeking His pleasure. And when is the best time for that? Every time is the best time, but a unique time is Ramadan. So you reflect on Allah's blessings and your inability to enumerate them, much less fully express gratitude for them. Number one, you reflect on the shortcomings and how our blessings are often used, the blessings of Allah are used to disobey Him. And number three, we look to the future and we see how little time is really left, focusing on catching up. So what do all of these three things have in common? Contemplating the blessings in our inability to be fully grateful, contemplating our shortcomings, and realizing that we do not have a lot of time. What do all three of these have in common? What do they all require? They require reflection. What does reflection require? It requires time and it requires focus. What is the biggest impediment to those two things? I was talking about it in the khutbah yesterday, in the second khutbah. Distractions. Distractions. Our inability to sit quietly without multitasking. Right? So here's a homework assignment between now and next week. Just try to sit down without a phone for 30 minutes in silence. That's it. Think about the blessings of Allah, step one. Think about your own personal shortcomings and bad habits that we all struggle with. And think about the lack of time. Just think about these things. 30 minutes. And what you'll notice in that, for many of us, we'll find that within a few minutes, our mind starts to go in every single valley and every nook and cranny, thinking about everything else except those three things. Because the monkey mind, as they describe it, is looking for other things to distract itself. Where, we start, our fingers start twitching, looking for the phone to tap. So this is a homework assignment, because if you can do that, you can set aside time for reflection. When you can reflect, you can think of these three things, contemplate them. When you can contemplate them, you come to a state of yaqadha, of wakefulness. Now, there's other ways of becoming Islamically woke, of wakefulness. There's other ways. A believer may not be thinking about these things, but Allah brings them to a state of wakefulness. So it could be that Allah Ta'ala simply cast a deep feeling of remorse and a drive to change in the hearts of people. This happened with Fudayl ibn Iyad, rahimahullah. Fudayl ibn Iyad, many of you know him, one of the great imams of hadith, one of the great zuhad from the ummah. He used to be a highway robber from Quta' al-Tariq. And when people would hear that he was around, they would flee. And there's actually more than one person from the early generations who were highway robbers. And he was sitting on a wall one day, and he heard someone recite the ayah, أَلَمْ يَأْنِ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَن تَخْشَعَ قُلُوبُهُمْ لِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. Has not the time come for those who believe that their hearts be humbly submitted to Allah and what He has revealed of the truth? And when he heard this ayah, it's like he heard it for the first time. And he says, indeed, Ya Allah, the time has come. Allah cast the power of that ayah, it was cast into his heart in that moment, and he changed. And he walked out and saw people at a campfire, and he says, I'm Fudayl ibn Iyad. They said, oh no, you're the highway robber. He said, no, I've made tawbah. And he went on to become one of the best of the Muslims. Allah just cast that into the heart in one moment. That's possible. And subhanAllah, about this ayah, it's in Surah Al-Hadid. Is it Meccan or Medinan? Does anyone know? Surah Al-Hadid, Mecca or Madani? Mecca. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said that this ayah was revealed 4 years after the beginning of Revelation. 4 years. In Mecca, Allah Ta'ala says, has not the time come for those who believe that their hearts be humbly submitted to the truth, to Allah and what He's revealed of the truth. So subhanAllah, that's one way. Another way of wakefulness that comes is when Allah Ta'ala decrees that a person experience some tragedy, some catastrophe, such as an accident or a test that wakes them up out of their previous heedlessness. Something happens in their life that really shakes them to their core. It makes them realize, okay, this is real. I have to get serious. That is a tribulation or a misfortune, but it's a ni'mah as well, because Allah brings from that a state of yaqadha from the person. Lastly, a person may come into yaqadha by simply burning out. There are many people like this. Many people who are living lives of debauchery and sin and ghafla, but they're Muslims. And eventually they burn themselves out from this lifestyle, and they realize that they are not living their purpose, and this drives them to a state of tawbah and becoming better. So wakefulness is a gift from Allah Ta'ala that can come suddenly, or it may come gradually through a series of life events, or it's cultivated actively by us, number one, thinking about Allah's blessings and our inability to enumerate them, number one, and much less be thankful for all of them individually. Number two, thinking about our own shortcomings and faults. And number three, realizing the passing of days and the fact that we do not have a lot of time. We do not have a lot of time. This is one of those things that you are intimately aware of once you hit your 40s. You could get away with it in your 30s. You can definitely get away with it in your 20s. when days seem to go longer, weeks take longer. But when you're getting into your 40s, you realize, subhanAllah, most of my life is done. So realizing that is true, whether you're 10 years old or 40 or 60, that is a step as well. When these three are put together, one comes into yaqadha. And it is really that light that Allah casts in the heart where a person realizes enough is enough, right? They say, you have to reach for real change. You have to reach a state where you say, I am sick and tired of this and I'm not going to take it anymore. You know, the person who's struggling with weight loss and health, they have to reach a state where they're so sick of it all, they're fed up with themselves and they say, you know what, I'm sick of this, I'm not going to take it anymore, and then they make change. So that yaqadha is that feeling that grips the servant where they essentially say to themselves, this is not who I am. I'm not living my purpose. I am going to die. So I have to shake off the slumber, shake off the laziness, get rid of the heedlessness, and commit to actually living my life with a sense of purposeness. So may Allah Ta'ala grant us this yaqadha, the very first stage in the path of virtue. Anyone know what the second stage is after the yaqadha? We talk about it tomorrow, inshallah, but who knows what it is? After you wake up, what's the second stage? It's tawbah. You have to repent from those things. So the second stage after yaqadha is tawbah. And this is the hierarchy. All of the ulama speak about this in the hierarchy of virtues. They mention that tawbah is the first, and others say yaqadha comes before tawbah because you have to wake up before you make the actual tawbah. And so tawbah will be the next virtue we speak about tomorrow, inshallah, as well as next Saturday. It takes 2 sessions because it's quite a detailed series, inshallah. هذا وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Someone left their keys. I'm sure you're not going to get very far without them, so they're here.